The tension in the Senate hearing room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat at the witness table, her burgundy blazer crisp, her expression calm but determined. Across from her, Senator Marsha Blackburn leaned back in her chair with that familiar smirk, the one that had become her trademark during heated political exchanges. What started as a routine Judiciary Committee hearing was about to become the political showdown of the year. Senator Blackburn had just finished what she thought was a devastating attack on Crockett's voting record, her voice dripping with condescension as she questioned the young representative's experience and qualifications. The room was silent, waiting for Crockett's response. But what happened next left everyone speechless. Jasmine Crockett didn't just respond. She delivered a masterclass in political precision that would be talked about for months. In the next 20 minutes, this rising Democratic star would systematically dismantle one of the GOP's most vocal senators. Armed with nothing but facts, fierce determination, and a level of preparation that caught everyone off guard, the crowd was left breathless. The internet exploded, and Senator Blackburn, well, let's just say she didn't see it coming. Before we dive into this incredible political moment, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, so you never miss these jaw-dropping political confrontations. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold, you need to know the players in this political chess match. At 71 years old, Senator Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee had built her reputation as one of the most aggressive conservative voices in Washington. With her perfectly styled blonde hair and sharp business suits, she commanded respect, and sometimes fear, from both sides of the aisle. Blackburn wasn't just any senator. She was a seasoned political warrior who had climbed from the Tennessee State Senate to the U.S. House and finally to the Senate in 2018. Known for her lightning-quick rebuttals and her ability to turn any hearing into a conservative talking point, she had made a career out of dismantling younger, less experienced Democrats. Her specialty, finding the weak spots in her opponent's records and exploiting them with surgical precision. She'd done it to countless witnesses, representatives, and even fellow senators. Today, she thought she had found her next victim. Sitting across from this political veteran was 43-year-old Jasmine Crockett, the freshman representative from Texas's 30th District. But calling her a freshman was misleading. This woman had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Crockett wasn't your typical politician. Before entering Congress in 2023, she had been a civil rights attorney and a state representative who had made her name fighting for criminal justice reform and voting rights. Her rise had been meteoric, from local politics to the national stage in just a few years. What made Crockett dangerous wasn't just her legal background. It was her ability to combine policy expertise with street-smart communication. She could break down complex legislation into language that everyday Americans could understand. And she wasn't afraid to call out hypocrisy when she saw it. Today's hearing was supposed to be about voting rights legislation, on a topic both women felt passionately about, but from completely opposite perspectives. Blackburn saw it as federal overreach that threatened states' rights. Crockett saw it as essential protection for democracy itself. The setup was perfect for confrontation. An experienced conservative senator, known for her aggressive questioning style, versus a rising progressive star with a law degree and nothing to lose. The C-SPAN cameras were rolling, social media was watching, and the entire political world was about to witness something special. For the first hour of the hearing, things had proceeded normally. Various witnesses had testified about voting access, election security, and ballot procedures. Blackburn had asked her usual pointed questions, and the responses had been predictably careful and measured. But then it was Crockett's turn to testify. As she approached the witness table, something shifted in the room's energy. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, confident but not arrogant, prepared but not rehearsed. Or maybe it was the folder of documents she placed carefully in front of her, organized with the precision of someone who had done her homework. Blackburn, reviewing her notes, looked up with that familiar smile. She had no idea she was about to face the most prepared opponent of her political career. The stage was set, the cameras were rolling, and America was about to witness a political education. Senator Blackburn called the hearing back to order, her gavel echoing through the marble chamber. We'll now hear testimony from Representative Jasmine Crockett regarding H.R. 1, the so-called For the People Act. The emphasis on so-called wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Blackburn was already framing the legislation as something deceptive, something not quite what it claimed to be. Crockett began her testimony methodically, outlining the key provisions of the Voting Rights Bill. She spoke about automatic voter registration, expanded early voting, and provisions to prevent voter suppression. Her delivery was calm, factual, and thoroughly researched. "Thank you, Representative Crockett," Blackburn interrupted smoothly. "Now, I have some questions about your claims regarding voter suppression." Here it came. The room tensed slightly as Blackburn shuffled her papers with theatrical precision. "Representative Crockett, you've made some pretty serious allegations about voter suppression in various states. But isn't it true that many of these states actually saw record voter turnout in recent elections?" It was a classic Blackburn move. Take a complex issue and reduce it to a simple talking point that seemed to contradict the witness's position. Crockett didn't miss a beat. "Senator, respectfully, high turnout doesn't mean suppression didn't occur. When people have to wait 8 hours in line to vote, when polling places are closed in communities of color, when students can't use their college IDs to vote, that's suppression, even if some people persist through those barriers." Blackburn's smile tightened slightly. This wasn't going as smoothly as usual. "Well, Representative, those sound like talking points rather than facts. Do you have specific evidence of these 8-hour wait times you mention?" This was the moment. Crockett reached for her folder with the calm confidence of a lawyer who had just been asked the exact question she'd hoped for. "I do, Senator. In fact, I have quite a bit of evidence." What happened next caught everyone off guard. Crockett didn't just cite one or two examples. She began systematically going through case after case, state by state, with precise details that could only come from months of careful research. In Harris County, Texas, voters in predominantly Black and Latino precincts waited an average of 95 minutes, while voters in predominantly white precincts waited 6 minutes. In Georgia, 214 polling places were closed between 2012 and 2020, with 70% of those closures in counties with growing Black populations. She wasn't reading from notes. She was speaking from memory, rattling off statistics and specifics that painted a devastating picture of systematic voter suppression. Blackburn tried to interrupt several times, but Crockett was in full flow, and parliamentary procedure required that she be allowed to finish her answer. The senator's confident demeanor began to crack slightly as she realized this wasn't going to be the easy takedown she had expected. "Representative, these allegations," Blackburn began. "They're not allegations, Senator. They're documented facts from your own state election boards and the Department of Justice," Crockett replied firmly, sensing she was losing control of the narrative. Blackburn shifted tactics. "Representative Crockett, you've been in Congress for less than 2 years. Don't you think it's presumptuous to lecture senators who've been working on these issues for decades?" It was a classic establishment move. Attack the person's experience rather than engage with their arguments. The room fell silent. This was clearly meant to put the younger representative in her place. But Crockett's response would become the stuff of political legend. "Senator, with respect, length of service doesn't automatically equal expertise. And frankly, if decades of work on these issues had been effective, we wouldn't be here today discussing the same problems." The audience stirred. This was getting personal, and Crockett wasn't backing down. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "my experience as a civil rights attorney representing clients whose voting rights were violated gives me a perspective that I believe is valuable to this discussion." Blackburn's face flushed slightly. She wasn't used to witnesses fighting back this effectively. "Representative, I find your tone concerning. Perhaps you should remember where you are." The condescension was unmistakable. It hung in the air like a challenge. Crockett paused for just a moment, and in that silence, everyone in the room could feel that something significant was about to happen. The young representative from Texas was about to remind the senior senator from Tennessee exactly where they both were, and why that mattered. "Senator," Crockett said quietly, "I know exactly where I am. The question is, do you?" The room was electric now. C-SPAN's cameras captured every nuance of expression, every shift in body language. This had moved far beyond a typical hearing into something much more significant. A generational clash, a test of wills, and a moment that would define both women's political futures. Blackburn, realizing she had perhaps pushed too hard, tried to regain control. "Let's return to the substance of the legislation." But it was too late. Crockett had seized the momentum, and she wasn't about to let it go. What came next would be remembered as one of the most devastating takedowns in congressional hearing history. The moment had arrived. Jasmine Crockett sat forward slightly, her hands folded calmly on the table, but her eyes blazing with an intensity that made everyone in the room lean in. Senator Blackburn had just asked if she knew where she was, and now the entire political world was about to find out exactly what happens when you underestimate the wrong person. Senator Blackburn, Crockett began, her voice steady but powerful, I know exactly where I am. I'm in the United States Senate in a hearing about protecting the fundamental right to vote. The same right that people died for. The same right that your own state of Tennessee has systematically worked to restrict. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. But since you've questioned my experience and my tone, let me tell you what I know about your record on voting rights. What happened next was like watching a master chess player reveal that they'd been thinking 15 moves ahead the entire time. Crockett didn't just respond to Blackburn's attacks. She systematically dismantled the senator's entire political record with surgical precision. In 2013, you celebrated the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder, which gutted the Voting Rights Act. You called it a victory for states' rights. Within 24 hours of that decision, your home state of Tennessee implemented voter ID laws that had been blocked under federal oversight. Blackburn tried to interrupt. Representative, I'm not finished, Senator, Crockett said firmly. You asked about my experience. Let me tell you about yours. Crockett opened her folder and began what could only be described as a masterclass in political accountability. She had done something that very few politicians ever do, had actually researched her opponent's complete voting record. In 2018, you voted against the Voting Rights Advancement Act. In 2019, you opposed the For the People Act. In 2021, you voted against the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. You've consistently opposed every single piece of voting rights legislation that has come before Congress. Each fact was delivered with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. But Crockett wasn't done. But here's what's really interesting, Senator. In your 2018 campaign, you received over $2.3 million from organizations that have actively worked to restrict voting access. The Bradley Foundation, the Heritage Foundation, and Americans for Prosperity, all major funders of voter suppression efforts across the country. The gasps in the hearing room were audible. This wasn't typical political sparring. This was a complete evisceration backed by receipts. Blackburn's face had gone from confident to concerned to something approaching panic. Representative, these accusations are, Blackburn began. They're public record, Senator, Crockett interrupted smoothly. All of this information is available on the FEC website and in your own campaign finance disclosures. But Crockett wasn't satisfied with just policy disagreements. She was about to make this personal in a way that would resonate far beyond the hearing room. Senator, you've questioned my qualifications and my experience. So, let me tell you about mine. I didn't come to Congress from a career in politics. I came here after spending years as a civil rights attorney representing people whose voices had been silenced. Her voice grew more passionate as she continued, and you could see the genuine emotion behind her words. I represented an 85-year-old black woman in Dallas who had voted in every election for 60 years, until your preferred voter ID laws prevented her from voting because her maiden name was on her birth certificate, but her married name was on her driver's license. This woman, Mrs. Dorothy Johnson, had walked 3 miles to vote in 1963 despite threats and intimidation. She had never missed an election, not once, until the laws you championed took away her voice. The room was completely silent now. Even the C-SPAN cameras seemed to be holding their breath as Crockett painted this vivid picture of real-world impact. I represented college students who were told their university IDs weren't valid for voting, but their hunting licenses were. Think about that for a moment, Senator. State-issued student ID from the University of Texas, good enough to check out library books and take final exams, somehow wasn't secure enough to vote. But a hunting license? Perfectly acceptable. The absurdity hung in the air, and several people in the gallery shook their heads in disbelief. I represented working mothers who couldn't afford to take time off work to get a free voter ID that required documents that cost money to obtain. One woman, Maria Gonzalez, had to choose between losing a day's wages or losing her right to vote. She was a single mother of 3, working 2 jobs, and your simple ID requirement meant she couldn't afford to exercise her constitutional right. Crockett stood up now, her full presence commanding the room. So, when you ask me about my experience, Senator, I don't point to decades in Washington making deals with lobbyists. I point to real people whose constitutional rights were violated by the exact policies you've spent your career promoting. The devastation was complete. But Crockett had one more surprise. And since you've questioned whether I understand the importance of this institution, let me remind you of something. This building, these halls, this very room, they represent the promise of democracy. A promise that every American, regardless of race, class, or zip code, has an equal voice in choosing their leaders. You sit in a chamber where people like Strom Thurmond once filibustered civil rights legislation for 24 hours. Where people like Jesse Helms built careers on denying Americans their most basic rights. And now you're carrying on that tradition, wrapped in the language of states' rights and election integrity. The comparison was devastating and historically accurate. Blackburn's political philosophy was being placed in its proper historical context, and it wasn't flattering. The weight of history seemed to settle over the chamber as Crockett connected the dots between past and present voter suppression efforts. Senator, you invoke the names of the Founding Fathers when you talk about states' rights. But let me remind you what Thomas Jefferson actually said. We do not have government by the majority. We have government by the majority who participate. Your policies ensure that fewer people participate, not more. The constitutional scholarship was impressive, but it was the moral clarity that made it devastating. Crockett wasn't just citing history. She was using it to expose the fundamental contradiction in Blackburn's position. But Crockett saved her most powerful moment for last. So, I have a question for you, Senator Blackburn. When you go home to Tennessee and look at yourself in the mirror, how do you justify making it harder for Americans to exercise the most fundamental right in a democracy? How do you sleep at night knowing that your policies disproportionately harm communities of color, young people, and working families? The question hung in the air like a judgment. It wasn't just a political attack. It was a moral challenge that demanded an answer. Senator Blackburn sat there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds. Her usual quick wit had abandoned her. Her prepared talking points suddenly seemed inadequate. For the first time in her political career, Marsha Blackburn was truly speechless. When she finally spoke, her voice lacked its usual authority. Representative, I pritch. These characterizations of my record are unfair and taken out of context. It was weak, and everyone in the room knew it. Senator Crockett replied calmly. The only context that matters is the impact your votes have had on real people's lives. And that impact has been to make voting harder, not easier. In her moment of complete triumph, Crockett did something unexpected. Instead of continuing the attack, she offered a path forward. But here's the thing, Senator. We can change course. We can choose to expand democracy instead of restricting it. We can choose to trust voters instead of suppressing them. The question is, will you join us in that effort? It was a masterful end to a devastating performance. Crockett had not only destroyed her opponent's arguments, but had done so while maintaining the moral high ground and offering a constructive path forward. The hearing room erupted in applause, something that almost never happens in Senate hearings. Even some Republicans were nodding in acknowledgement of what they had just witnessed. The moment Representative Jasmine Crockett finished speaking, the political world exploded. What had just happened in that Senate hearing room wasn't just a debate. It was a seismic shift that would reshape how Americans thought about voting rights, political accountability, and the power of speaking truth to authority. The immediate aftermath in the hearing room was unlike anything veteran political reporters had ever witnessed. As Crockett finished her devastating takedown, the usually stoic Senate chamber erupted in ways that violated decades of decorum. Staffers were frantically typing on their phones, sending clips to their bosses. Reporters in the gallery were already crafting headlines in their minds. CNN's congressional correspondent, who had covered Capitol Hill for 15 years, later said, "It was the most electric moment I've ever witnessed in a committee hearing." The energy was palpable. You could feel that something historically significant had just occurred. But the real explosion happened in the digital realm. Within the first 10 minutes after the hearing ended, #CrocketCallsOut was trending not just nationally, but internationally. Political observers in London, Berlin, and Tokyo were sharing clips with commentary about American democracy and the power of moral clarity in political discourse. The most shared clip wasn't even the full exchange. It was a 30-second supercut that someone had created, showing Blackburn's confident opening statements followed immediately by her speechless reaction to Crockett's final question. The visual contrast was devastating and went viral across every social media platform simultaneously. TikTok users, particularly young people of color, began creating response videos using Crockett's "How do you sleep at night?" question as a soundtrack for their own commentary about voting rights and political accountability. The phrase became a meme, but one with serious political implications. What made this moment even more significant was how it transcended typical political boundaries. Major corporations that usually stayed silent on political issues began issuing statements about the importance of voting rights. Apple CEO Tim Cook retweeted the clip with the comment, "Democracy requires participation. Thank you at Jasmine for standing up for every American's right to have their voice heard." Hollywood celebrities who had remained politically neutral suddenly found themselves inspired to speak out. Oprah Winfrey shared the video on Instagram with a lengthy caption about the importance of protecting voting rights. Even traditionally apolitical sports figures began commenting, with LeBron James tweeting, "This is what real leadership looks like. Facts plus passion plus courage equals change." The entertainment industry's response was particularly significant because it showed how Crockett's moral clarity had cut through typical partisan divides. When someone speaks with genuine conviction about fundamental democratic principles, it resonates with people regardless of their usual political affiliations. Late-night comedy shows immediately began incorporating clips of the exchange into their monologues. Stephen Colbert dedicated an entire segment to what he called the night Jasmine Crockett taught a masterclass in political preparation. The clip of Blackburn's speechless reaction became a recurring meme across all the late-night programs. But perhaps most tellingly, several major news anchors who prided themselves on objectivity couldn't hide their admiration for Crockett's performance. NBC's Lester Holt, known for his careful neutrality, concluded his evening news segment by noting that regardless of one's political affiliation, it was impossible not to be impressed by Representative Crockett's preparation and passion. The raw viewership numbers told the story of a moment that transcended typical political theater. C-SPAN, which usually struggles to attract viewers for committee hearings, saw a 2,400% spike in live streaming for the final hour of the hearing. YouTube videos of the exchange were uploaded dozens of times by different users, collectively gathering millions of views. More importantly, voter registration websites in Texas, Tennessee, and across the country reported significant traffic spikes in the hours following the hearing. Organizations like Rock the Vote and the NAACP saw donation surges as Americans inspired by Crockett's words decided to get more involved in protecting voting rights. The response from Washington was swift and telling. Democratic leadership immediately recognized that they had a new star on their hands. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi issued a statement calling Crockett's testimony a powerful reminder of why we fight for voting rights every single day. Progressive leaders like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ayanna Pressley took to social media to praise Crockett's performance. AOC tweeted, "This is what happens when you send a civil rights attorney to Congress." At Jasmine came with facts, moral clarity, and the courage to speak truth to power. But perhaps more significantly, several moderate Democrats who had been hesitant about voting rights legislation suddenly found themselves facing pressure to take stronger stands. The moral clarity of Crockett's argument made it harder for fence-sitters to justify inaction. The Republican response was telling in its diversity. Some, like Senator Ted Cruz, tried to dismiss Crockett's testimony as partisan grandstanding. Others, like Senator Mitt Romney, acknowledged the power of her arguments while disagreeing with her conclusions. But the most significant response came from within Tennessee itself. Several Republican state legislators, clearly uncomfortable with being associated with Blackburn's performance, began distancing themselves from the most restrictive voting measures pending in the state legislature. Senator Blackburn herself attempted damage control through a series of television appearances, but her usual confidence was noticeably shaken. In an interview with Sean Hannity, she seemed defensive and off her typical talking points, leading political observers to note that she had clearly been rattled by the encounter. For Crockett personally, the hearing transformed her from a promising freshman representative into a national political figure overnight. Within 48 hours of the hearing, she had gained over 200,000 new followers on Twitter and Instagram combined. More importantly, she began receiving speaking requests from Democratic organizations across the country. The Democratic National Committee reached out about featuring her at upcoming events, and several political action committees, focusing on voting rights asked her to headline fundraisers. But perhaps most significantly, political analysts began mentioning her name in discussions about future Democratic leadership. At just 43 years old, Crockett had demonstrated the kind of preparation, moral clarity, and communication skills that party leaders desperately needed. Crockett's performance had implications far beyond her own political career. Her systematic destruction of Blackburn's record provided a blueprint for how Democrats could more effectively challenge Republican talking points on voting rights. Instead of getting bogged down in policy details or defensive responses, Crockett had demonstrated the power of moral clarity combined with meticulous preparation. She had shown that it was possible to be both factual and passionate, both specific and inspiring. Voting rights organizations reported that Crockett's testimony had given them new ammunition in their own advocacy efforts. The specific examples she cited, the historical context she provided, and the moral framework she established became standard talking points for activists across the country. While the immediate legislative impact was limited, the Senate's procedural rules still prevented comprehensive voting rights legislation from passing. The political landscape had shifted significantly. Public opinion polling in the weeks following the hearing showed increased support for voting rights protections, particularly among independent voters who had been undecided on the issue. Crockett's moral framing of voting rights as a fundamental democratic principle resonated with Americans who might have otherwise seen it as partisan politics. Several corporate leaders who had previously avoided taking stands on voting rights issues began speaking out in favor of expanded access. The moral clarity of Crockett's argument made it harder for business leaders to justify silence on what she had framed as a fundamental question of democratic values. Political historians were quick to note the broader significance of what had transpired. Dr. Keisha Blaine, a historian at the University of Pittsburgh, wrote that Crockett's testimony represented a new chapter in the long struggle for voting rights, one where preparation meets passion and moral clarity cuts through political spin. The hearing was compared to other historic moments when individual lawmakers had used their platforms to advance moral arguments that transcended partisan politics. Crockett's performance was mentioned alongside Barbara Jordan's Watergate testimony and John Lewis's speeches during the Civil Rights era. The attention wasn't entirely positive for Crockett. She began receiving both passionate support and vicious attacks from across the political spectrum. Her office reported a significant increase in both positive and negative communications from constituents and Americans nationwide. Security concerns led to increased protection for the representative, as some of the criticism crossed the line into threats. But Crockett handled the pressure with the same grace and determination she had shown in the hearing room. In interviews following the hearing, she remained focused on the substance of voting rights rather than the personal attention. "This isn't about me," she told one reporter. "This is about protecting the fundamental right that makes all other rights possible." Perhaps most importantly, Crockett's performance had demonstrated something crucial about American politics in the social media age. Authenticity and moral clarity could still cut through the noise. Her success wasn't based on partisan talking points or political calculation. It was based on genuine conviction, backed by meticulous preparation. This had implications for how future political battles would be fought. Crockett had shown that voters still responded to leaders who could articulate clear moral principles and back them up with facts. Her performance became required viewing for political communications staff across Washington. As the weeks passed, it became clear that the hearing represented a turning point, not just for Crockett personally, but for the broader voting rights movement. Her moral framing of the issue had shifted the national conversation from technical legal debates to fundamental questions about democracy and representation. Young Democrats across the country began citing Crockett as inspiration for their own political involvement. Law students at historically black colleges and universities reported increased interest in civil rights law and political careers. The ripple effects continued to spread as Crockett used her newfound platform to continue advocating for voting rights. She became a regular fixture on news programs, always armed with the same combination of moral clarity and detailed preparation that had made her hearing testimony so powerful. What happened in that Senate hearing room was more than just good political theater. It was a reminder of what American democracy could be at its best. When preparation meets passion, when moral clarity confronts political calculation, and when someone is willing to speak truth to power regardless of the consequences, extraordinary things can happen. Jasmine Crockett had reminded the nation that democracy isn't just about procedures and processes. It's about values and principles. And sometimes those principles are worth fighting for, even when the odds seem overwhelming. The crowd wasn't just left breathless, they were left inspired. And in American politics, inspiration backed by preparation can be the most powerful force of all. What you just witnessed was more than political theater. It was a masterclass in how to fight for what's right with both passion and precision. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a debate. She reminded us all what principled leadership looks like in action. If this incredible display of courage and preparation inspired you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you never miss these jaw-dropping moments when truth meets power in American politics. Hit that notification bell, because political moments like this don't happen every day. But when they do, you'll want to see them first. What did you think of Representative Crockett's performance? Drop a comment below and let us know if you think more politicians should come this prepared to defend democracy. And share this video with anyone who needs to see what real political courage looks like. We'll be diving into how Senator Blackburn has responded to this devastating takedown and whether other Republicans are learning from her mistakes. You won't want to miss it. Remember to subscribe, like, and comment. Engagement helps us bring you more of these incredible political moments that really matter.